here we are with a solo podcast special, and it's not a Q&A. This time out, I am sharing with you what I wrote as an Instagram post and then an email to my email list about 30 things I've learned and realized by the grand old age of 30. It was really popular as an Instagram post. I've written a variation of it depending on my age for the last 3 or 4 years now, and I found it quite fun to actually write it out and see how it's adapted over time. Of course, there's some consistencies across the piece, but there's also been some evolution, some change, which you would hope so as you grow up and mature, particularly as the last 2.5 years I've been doing the podcast, and there's been a tremendous amount that I've taken on board from that. So the format I'll do is I'll share all 30 and I'll share a little bit of discussion around each of the 30 points to give some background to it, because some of the points are very short and concise, and while some of them are self-explanatory, some I can go a little bit deeper on. So let's kick off. Number one, most procrastination comes from internal discomfort and you seeking to escape it. That's something that I learned from Nir Eyal and his book Indistractable. And then, of course, I got to host him on the podcast as well. So much of us wanting to procrastinate and not do the thing that we said we were going to do comes from the fact that we feel uncomfortable. We're unsure about the next step. We're unsure how to do it. We're unsure how to move forward. And instead, we desperately want to escape that feeling of discomfort and that dis-ease, and we will do anything to get away from it. And quite often that means we turn to things like our phones, social media. I remember when I was studying for some of my insurance exams in my previous career, and I didn't ever love cleaning the flat. I did it, but before I hired a cleaner for outsourcing and freeing up some of that time. But when I had the choice between sitting down and doing another chapter of my insurance module or cleaning the flat, I was cleaning the flat. The place was absolutely spotless. So you will do anything to procrastinate and escape from eternal discomfort, whether that's something you maybe don't really want to do, or that's something you're not too sure of. You'll procrastinate and push things backwards, which is obviously not a good thing. And so much of that comes from internal rather than external drivers, because I wasn't driven to necessarily check my phone. I wasn't driven necessarily to clean the flat, but I was looking to escape from something. Number two, ensure you speak to yourself respectfully and with compassion as you would a friend. This is a big lesson from Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. And I've really taken it on board in two different dimensions. The first of those, of course, with respect and compassion, because quite often, if a friend was in the same circumstances as you are and you find yourself, you wouldn't speak to them in the way that you might speak to yourself. You would probably speak to them with a lot more compassion and respect. You would take on board their circumstances and try and understand and look for a way forward, where sometimes our self-talk can be extremely negative, it can be belittling, it can undermine yourself and ultimately not move you forward. The other interesting aspect is sometimes we actually give ourselves excuses that we wouldn't give to other people around us as well. So, in the reverse, in terms of compassion, treating yourself with respect also involves having a harsh word with yourself when needed. So, if you saw a friend making terrible life decisions and not recognizing those choices were having a negative impact, you would maybe tell them as a duty of care, you should do the same to yourself. So, if you are binge drinking regularly and you're wondering why you're not making progress with your diet or your career, then maybe address the elephant in the room. If you are still texting your ex when you feel upset and feel lonely, then you would have a word with your friend if they were doing that. In the same way, you should treat yourself in the same vein, and with this, hold yourself to the same standards and support yourself in the same way that you would your very best friend. Number three, if you still listen to the radio in the car, you're not going to make it. Podcasts, audiobooks, or at worst, hype tunes. Fairly self-explanatory. I feel that in the busy lives that we lead, we should make the most of what we are putting into our eyes and our ears. And when you're commuting in the car, or if you are on the train or public transport, take the time to listen to things that are going to help you. I'm not going to hate on the radio, but they choose the music. You have something in your pocket which chooses any music you want, but also more importantly, it chooses any podcast, any audiobook, anything that you want to put in your ears. You can use that time so wisely and really benefit from it. And for me, using the time that I've had over the years when I'm moving about between places to level up my mindset has been something that I could not put a price on. And if I'd spent that time listening to like a DJ filling a slot on a radio station, I don't think I would be in the same position I'm in just now, and enjoying the relative success and clarity of thought and mind that I benefit from. Number 4, do not judge the actions of the historic past by the standards and lenses of today. This is huge for me because I see people being like retrospectively cancelled for things they said or did in even recent history, but even further back beyond that, we see people criticised for what happened in the 18th, the 19th, the 20th century by the standards that we hold ourselves today. And anyone that has grown up in the last 5 to 10 years will radically have seen a change in what language is deemed acceptable and politically correct, to an extent that it's actually quite difficult to know what terms are okay and which are not all of a sudden. Like even in my time at university between 2010 and 2014, the world became a lot more politically correct during that period, and a lot of words came off the table. And that has accelerated even more so since I graduated in 2014. I think it's so important that we don't look at historical figures and hold them to the standards that we hold ourselves today, because quite simply, that was not what the expected thing is. I think one of the best examples is, depending what generation you're from, your grandparents would have used words to describe ethnic minorities which would be deemed deeply offensive today, or at least some sort of hatred, whereas they weren't saying it from a place of hatred, in my opinion. And in their opinion, they wouldn't have been saying it from a place of hatred. They would have been shortening the name for the news agents or whatever to the country of origin they came from. And it wasn't an act of hate because they were spending their money with them. They probably went in and chatted to them every single day. And I think it's very important you look back on people from these eras with relative understanding of what the circumstances were like during that period and what they accepted boundaries and social norms were at that time. You can argue the rights or wrongs of whether some of those were correct, but you certainly shouldn't retrospectively punish them for acts that they did when at the time that was pretty much the done thing. Number 5, dollar cost averaging is an admin light and effective investment strategy. For me, I have been lucky to host so many different investors, traders, and financially successful people on the podcast. And when I've assessed where my risk appetite, my risk tolerance, but also my time that I'm willing to put into investing is, dollar cost averaging, or pound cost averaging, as Pete Matthew would tell me in a recent episode, is absolutely the strategy that I like the best for myself. And this is absolutely not financial advice, but if you are somebody that has a lot on your plate, but you want exposure to a number of different assets and you want to set yourself up for your future and give yourself the best possible opportunity, then considering averaging into a range of different assets on a weekly, a fortnightly, or a monthly basis is absolutely the lowest admin, most effective strategy for generating long-term personal wealth. And if that's not a goal that many people who listen to a podcast like this one share, then I don't know what is. So for me, I'm not somebody that tries to time the market. I'm not somebody that looks at charts particularly. I am somebody that has a direct debit to a number of different exchanges and brokerages, and I buy into different funds and stocks and shares and coins that I believe in for the longer term. Number 6, make social media social. Most of my closest friends have been made online. They are more like-minded. I have a handful of friends left from school, university, and work that I've met over the years. The rest of my friends and the people I spend the most time with, I've met through social media. And that for me is the clues in the name. Social media. You get to be social and network with the kind of people that you want to network with. You can be so selective, and you don't necessarily need to become best pals with everyone that you meet and really, really close with everyone you meet, but you can generate a network of people who are completely, or not completely, but fairly aligned with you in at least a number of different areas. And that can only be a good thing, because they share your goals, they share your values, and you can reach and search and filter for these people using these apps. There's so much positive benefits from using social media intentionally, and intentionally is the big part, not that doom scrolling, which a lot of us can fall into, and everyone is predisposed to do just based on how addictive the apps can be. But meeting up with people from social media that share the same interests, going to clubs or areas or events that are aligned with the kind of people that you want to meet, and connecting with them on socials and then building a deeper friendship afterwards is absolutely massive. For me, a lot of it was through the fitness industry initially, when I was sharing a lot more fitness-based content back in kind of 2017, 2018, 2019. And the people I met during that period, while some people I trained with, I never really caught up with again. That's obviously going to be the case. I met so many people that I'm still very, very good friends with today, and I'm very, very grateful for them. Many of those voices you've heard on the podcast in the early days were people that I met during that period when I was putting myself outside my comfort zone and meeting up with people from social media who I thought shared similar values to me, and a number of them did, and we're still very good friends to this day. Number 7, your diet is not just the food you eat, it's the media you consume and the people you talk to. That links a little bit to what I was talking about with number 3 when I talk about the radio. With the radio, you have a lot less control, and control is a big value of mine, because when you have things that you can have an influence over, control the controllables and let the other things fall as they may, you can absolutely control not just the diet of the nutrition, the food that you take in, but also the media you consume and the people you talk to. I suppose it also links to number 6 when I'm talking about social media. You can choose what's on your feed. You can choose the people that you message. You can choose the people you're in WhatsApp groups with. You can choose the people that you meet up with for a coffee. There's a lot of authority and empowerment that comes when you decide that you choose how you live your life. And for me, choosing the things that we consume is absolutely massive. I very rarely watch the news, and that's become a little bit of a cliche now. Like Brad Burton was talking about it when he was in the podcast. He hasn't watched the news for 9 months. He's never been happier. I, of course, stay relatively aware of current affairs, but do I tune into what the interest rates have changed to as of yesterday, whereas where they were the week before? No, of course I don't, because I just don't think there's massive value in that. I'm not aware of the latest scandal within the government or the latest scare story about what's happened at a school or something else terrible. I just don't think there's massive value in me tuning into that. I'd much rather be selective of what I consume. So that doesn't just go for your social media feed, but goes for the people that you talk to and the people you spend time with as well. Be extremely intentional within that and be selective of what your diet is across the board. Number 8, most people would rather be seen to do the right thing rather than do the right thing. There has been tremendous, and I say that in terms of size and volume rather than actual positivity of that, increase in the amount of virtue signaling that we see. And I think that's a negative side of social media. People signaling status through their virtue and like how good and virtuous I am, and being seen to do that rather than actually doing it. So I did have this conversation with both Gary McGowan and also Simon Thomas in the podcast. Simon Thomas was actually taking in Ukrainian refugees to support them with housing when they were displaced during the conflict with Russia. And I said, like, I feel quite uncomfortable when I see just people sharing like the Ukraine flag or changing their profile photo to a Ukraine flag. Like, I remember seeing so much of this over the years. Like, people would remember like Je suis Charlie when people changed their Facebook profile photos back in the day to like a French flag after the shooting in Paris. And what actually came of that? Like, yes, you showed solidarity, but it was just a signal of virtue rather than maybe doing the right thing, which is maybe having a really difficult conversation about extremism and how we manage that. That is a much more difficult thing to do, and people would much rather be seen to show their virtue and show their willingness to help a noble cause without actually really doing the help around it as well. It's a really challenging thing to say, because you don't want to discourage people from being good people and like trying to be good people, but there's a massive difference between showing you're a good person and actually being a good person. Again, one of the most profound conversations I've had on the podcast around charity was with Richard Dixon, who gets a tremendous amount of back and forth online from people. When I know behind the scenes, Richard is massive in terms of supporting the community that he comes from, things like food banks, parcels of support for people that are really in dire need. But because he doesn't necessarily film it and show it on social media and ram it down somebody's throat to show himself as a virtuous person, he comes in for criticism. And I find that absolutely hilarious, because if people really got into the nitty gritty and did a cost benefit analysis of the support that he's giving to people who are in need, they would be made to look quite foolish. And albeit I've now shared that in a public domain on the podcast, we did talk about it, and it's very, very funny that people would much rather be seen to be virtuous by sharing a post of their story or signing a petition or shouting about how bad like a particular government or a particular political figure is, but instead they should do a lot more closer to home that they can actually impact themselves. Number 9, I need to see more live music, but I did get better at this after turning 29. Yes, I certainly do need to see more live music. I absolutely love every time I go to an event of like I'm sure there'll be one that I go to in the future where I'm disappointed, but I always come away with such a buzz, and I think there's a unique stimulus that comes from live music. So I am making a commitment to doing this. I went to a few events when I was between 29 and 30, so that's absolutely a good thing. But I do know that I can fall into a habit where I don't do it often enough. So I need to make sure that I maintain that level of commitment towards it. Depending on when this podcast goes out, I will be in Dubai for 13 days, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to see somebody live at Zero Gravity or one of the other clubs there, because there's normally a few different people appearing, whether it's a DJ or an artist. Number 10, intermittent fast from your phone is taking up too much of your attention too often. So true, because we are just not designed to deal with this attention grabbing, amazing, powerful device that's in our pockets and in our hands far too often. While I'll acknowledge that I said in number one that a lot of our procrastination and our escapism is coming from internal discomfort, so much of what we do is still driven by the fact that there's notifications pinging off. We're desperate to check and find out what's happened next, whether that's even just checking things that have happened next to people around us rather than checking our own notifications. It's it's an interesting phenomenon, and I think by intermittent fasting and having set periods throughout the day where you do not touch it and do not look at it, you can really take back your attention. For me, that's between 9 p.m. at night and 8 a.m. in the morning. As much as possible, I'm trying to stay off my phone and not touch it. I'm actually very good at the nighttime part because that's all part of my bedtime routine. But in the morning, sometimes when I'm out on a walk, I am tempted to look at it and check WhatsApp and jump onto other things. But one of the things that is great about the iPhone is you can pop your AirPods in and say, "Hey Siri, play the podcast I've downloaded," or play Spotify, and then whatever the podcast name is. And again, it's kind of hands free, and it doesn't draw you into the whirlwind of notifications. And I return from my walk so much fresher and more engaged and more able to like go about my day because I haven't saturated it with like fast, cheap dopamine from just checking WhatsApp and dealing with that. Of course, there needs to come a point in the day when you do that, but you do it intentionally rather than just running to it before you've served yourself first. So by that point, I've hydrated, I've showered, I've stretched, I've tidied myself up. I'm ready for my day. I've gratitude journal. There's been so much that I've ticked off before it's time for me to engage with the outside world and deal with my phone. And there's a sense of empowerment that comes with that as well. Number 11, Jordan Peterson is a father figure and guide for a lot of young men, but many women are benefiting too. That was such an important thing that I noticed when I went to see Jordan live, that I think there's a stigma or a stick that's used to beat him that he is only a voice for men, and actually sometimes a negative voice because it's so focused on the masculine. But I would probably say about 30% of the audience was female. And I think if you ask some of the people who berate Jordan what percentage of the audience do you think are male, they would say like close to 100, probably over 90. But I was very glad to see that many women are benefiting from what Jordan has to say as well. And I don't think he's ever held himself up as a particular voice for a particular group, other than just saying he's there for people who need the support and feel disaffected or disenchanted and need support. He, from that perspective, is a father figure, and I'm very glad that there's a lot of females and women that are benefiting from Jordan's teachings as well. Number 12, if someone's serious about self-development and hasn't read Atomic Habits, they aren't serious. I truly mean that. And if that's triggering for anyone listening, I'm sorry, but the book is the foundation of understanding behavior change, why we do the things we do and how to make changes to that, whether that's good or bad habits. And the way that it's written is extremely easy to read. Like I don't think there's any book that I've breezed through on 2 occasions now quite so easily, because it's a real page turner. You feel engaged throughout. There's lots of examples. James Clear is a very clear writer. His email list is also something I read every Thursday, the 321 newsletter. And yeah, I truly think if you're serious about self-development, one of the underpinning things behind developing yourself and improving yourself is, of course, your behaviors and the things that you do, meaning that you should read a book that allows you to manage those habits to a large extent. Number 13, add fun and restful activities to your productivity to-do list. You need to tick these off too. This was something that I really stumbled across during the pandemic, where I had these long to-do lists because I wanted to use the time that I'd been granted and given back by the restrictions that we had and the reduction in the number of things that we could do to be productive. I started this podcast. I really committed to it. I started the email list. I really committed to that. I was still training. I was still taking things off. But the things that I started to add to it in order to make sure that I wasn't necessarily just doing the big hard things, I wanted to still feel good and get a positive feedback loop and reward for doing the things that are still important, like resting. So I'm always good for this, but you could if you're struggling with this, you could put like sleep 8 hours a night. I was putting things like call mum. I was putting things like watch Rangers. I was putting things like go for my walk. I was putting things like train push, train pull, train legs, whatever it was. I was putting things in, even like message, and I would put in a friend I hadn't caught up with for a little while. I was putting things in that were fun on this to-do list rather than just all about productivity and all about the most important things, because when you tick off those things, you should also realize how important they are to your overall well-being, and your overall productivity will benefit off the back of you doing the things that serve you best to feel like a good, happy human. What are we on to? Number 14. There is a better return on investment from removing bad habits and influence than always trying to add good ones. One of the biggest things you can do, and this is a hat tip to Atomic Habits as well, is remove some of the bad things that are happening within your day and within your week, because there's only a limited amount of time within your day and a limited amount of bandwidth. And I see people sometimes just cram in all these different things like, oh, in my morning routine, I'm going to have a cold shower, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to gratitude journal, I'm going to go round, I'm going to do Wim Hof breathing, I'm going to drink a salt drink and then a green shake. There's only so much room within your day to add in good positive habits, to actually fit them in and do them properly and commit to them and make them part of your routine. Otherwise, it just becomes a never-ending to-do list of positive things. Whereas some of the things you could remove. So I'm talking about a morning routine. The reason I've got time to gratitude journal and shower and stretch and read and whatever else I want to include is because I'm not checking my phone. So I removed waking up and checking my phone and dealing with social media straight away and seeing what was happening on Instagram and replying to WhatsApps and checking work emails and looking at my calendar. I removed that, meaning that I could do other things. So don't always try and add in new self-development hacks and good habits. Look at what you can remove. It might be that you remove the, like, well, I've joked again in the podcast, you've got guys that are pathological fappers. They've go to no fap. Of course, their life is going to improve off the back of that. So people can remove things that are negative and are having a downward effect on their productivity and their happiness, and that'll free up more time. And if you want to, you can fill that time with more productive things if you need to, or you could just fill it with less stress and less things to do. Number 15, almost no one is overtraining. They are under recovering. Try 8 quality hours of sleep daily. I truly believe that there's a very small percentage of people that are overtraining in terms of how hard they're pushing themselves in the gym or with their cardio as well. The vast majority of us, given the stress that we have, we're probably over caffeinated and underslept. And having 8 hours quality sleep on a regular basis, and that's not just 8 hours in bed, that's 8 hours of actual sleep. So you're not always, like, I think most people are on about between 80 to 90%, even if they're good sleepers, of the time that you're in bed. So it's very, very difficult for you to necessarily go to bed from 10 until 6 a.m. and say, yes, I've slept for 8 hours. You've probably slept for 6 to 7, hopefully, maybe sometimes near 8, depending on how good a sleeper you are. So for me, I think there's a massive benefit to looking after your sleep. I've been thankful to have 2 fantastic guests in that space. Nora Simpson is a professor at Stanford. That's back in episode 29. And she really explained the benefits when it came to performance, both mentally and physically, from sleep. So I believe that if you are worried about overtraining, you're worried about overstretching yourself, you probably got more capacity if you were to look after your recovery as well. Number 16, personal responsibility remains unfashionable. This links a little bit to the whole virtue signaling society that I was talking about earlier. So many people are all too happy to pass the blame and really just let somebody else take the fall for things that they themselves could absolutely be responsible for. They're all too happy to say, oh, like it's terrible, like I've got less money this year because the government and the cost of living and energy prices are up and I've now not got money to do this. Well, could you take responsibility and do something different? Could you have used some of your money last year to insulate your house better so that your energy costs are down? Now, I know I'm being a bit facetious there because I am not particularly pleased with where the energy crisis is going either. But there's so much that you can take responsibility for within your lifestyle without allowing other people to be like partly responsible for the destination you end up. There's so much that we can control. I'm talking about the media that we put into our minds earlier on this podcast. And I truly believe that when we take responsibility for the things that we do, the things we say, the things we think, there's real power and benefit from that. And I would much rather do those things than blame others for some of the circumstances that I find myself in. Of course, there's macro factors that are going to affect things, but please do not allow the noise and the shouting to be things that you say, oh, well, that's why I've not achieved the things that I want to achieve. There's so much that you can do yourself and put yourself in a better position. So please do take personal responsibility. It's unfashionable. And the kind of people that choose to listen to this on a regular basis and support shows like mine are the kind of people that are willing to take personal responsibility in most areas of their life. And I know there's areas in my life I need to continue taking more personal responsibility, and I tend to benefit massively when that happens. I don't blame colleagues when we lose a deal. I look at what I could have done better, whether that's even managing those colleagues better and getting the best from them. That should be on my responsibility as well, because ultimately I feel that there's a lot more that I can do to move things in the better direction necessarily than being like, oh, well, it was because such and such dropped the ball on the proposal. Well, actually, did I check in with such and such that they were happy with what they were meant to be doing? Did I provide them with advice that I knew that might be helpful to them performing at their best? Number 17, sobriety through choice for long periods is a competitive advantage. Embrace it and disregard societal norms. Again, another area that I've got huge bias in, and I have benefited hugely over the last number of years, where I've been extremely selective with the number of times I've chosen to drink alcohol. I think a lot of people are waking up to the fact that alcohol is a drug that has so many downsides, and if it was brought out today, it would be completely illegal. It's very much societally ingrained, and there are some big benefits to it from a social perspective and some of the events that it opens up to us. But there's also huge power in being able to attend events and be a happy person without the need for stimulants. And I truly encourage people to assess their relationship with alcohol and assess how much they actually need it. Like, are you using it as a crutch to make you more outgoing in social situations? Are you using it as a crutch to try and de-stress, but actually it's taking away from your happiness over the long term because it's sabotaging your sleep and your mood and your mindset, and it's making you poorer and making you fatter because it's giving you more calories? I won't get on my hobby horse too much, but I truly think that if you can be more selective when you drink, and I have been that this year. I drank twice in the summer, and depending when this goes out, I probably will have a drink at one of the brunches of the beach clubs in Dubai, because I will have decided that that's beneficial. But outside of that, it's so rare that you will ever see me have a drink. And there was a period when I did the full 2.5 years in a row, I was really wondering whether I would ever drink again, because it becomes harder and harder because you're just so happy with the level that you're operating at in terms of time, money, calories, mood, productivity. It really is a superpower. I cannot express the kind of compounding effect that I felt off the back of it. I think everyone should consider doing at least 6 to 10 weeks a year completely without alcohol if you've never done that before. Anyway, on to number 18. No one cares how many books you can read if the lessons from each have not been actioned. It is such a strange flex when people tell me how many books they've read, and or not necessarily tell me, but talk about how many books they've read and aren't able to bring forth different things that they've enacted within that as well. I really don't think I'm the most voracious reader, but I think I'm one of the most voracious actioners of what I have read. So Atomic Habits, I've read it twice. And so much of what I do day to day is based around making it easy to do my good habits, making it harder to do my bad habits, and identifying how I can design my environment around those to perform towards that. So I have rinsed and repeated. I've taken that book and gotten everything that I can get out of it. And that's amazing. Like, if that's the only book that I read, that's actually quite a good thing. Like, similar, I read How to Win Friends and Influence People, one of the first self-development books I got into. And there's probably 3 or 4 things that I do on a daily basis that are heavily influenced by that book because it had such a profound effect on me. I read it once and I was like, this is brilliant. I'm going to do these things. Whereas I think some people maybe just bounce from one book to the other, hoping that the magic and the secret will be within the pages. But the unfortunate truth of the matter is that the magic and the benefit is within the actions that you take off the back of the lessons that you learn from those books. Number 19. Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is not just for rebels and conspiracy theorists anymore. I definitely had a negative view of cryptocurrency up until mid to late 2020 when I started to get a little bit more educated on it. I started to open up my mind to the possibilities of the technology as well as the use cases for it. And in particular, Bitcoin, I think anyone that isn't fully aware of what it can do and what it stands for and what its use case is and what its longer term likelihood use is as a hedge for inflation and as an asset class, I think you need to spend a little bit of time looking into it. That's not the whole. I've talked about virtue signals here who shout educate yourself when they want to downplay some of these thoughts on like historical matters. But I absolutely think when it comes to crypto and Bitcoin, it's no longer just a niche thing for like crypto bros or for rebels or conspiracy theorists. It's very, very mainstream. There's so many people I speak to that have a holding in Bitcoin as part of an asset allocation. And for me, probably just under a third of my investments in terms of what I invest on an annual basis goes into the cryptocurrency market. And I hold a good amount of Bitcoin now, and I'm going to continue to do that. And I am not somebody I don't think the financial system's necessarily going to collapse immediately. I'm not a conspiracy theorist about the fiat system in its entirety. I think it's deeply flawed, but I don't think it's I'm not like a huge conspiracy theorist, although I've become a bit more open-minded to conspiracies in the last couple of years, just based on what I've seen reflected in the government. But I think a lot more people are open-minded now to crypto and its benefits. Number 20, spend quality time with your family at any given opportunity. This was something I spoke extremely passionately about on the Slater Inside Men's Mind podcast that I did back in September 2021, and I released it on my own show for episode 95. I really, really think that when you consider who and what is important to you in your flesh and blood, how often you spend time with them can vary massively depending on your location. And this episode will go out, that we're recording just now, will go out after I've spoken to Sahil Bloom. And he spoke about moving across the country from, I think it was California to New York, to be closer to his parents because he figured out that he would probably only see them about 15 more times if things continued at the current rate, because he was seeing them like once or twice a year for like Thanksgiving or Christmas. And by being closer to them, he sees them almost on a daily or a weekly basis. And that is much, much better for him. But I also implore you to spend quality time with them as well. Like at the time of recording, it's 8:30 on a Thursday night, and I finished work at 5 o'clock today, and I went and walked with my mum, and my phone was in my pocket the whole time. I was completely present. We talked about all sorts of things: work, relationships, like podcast, holiday plans, everything. It was absolutely amazing, and I was completely within that moment. And I will never get that time back if I had walked around there playing on my phone, checking Instagram, because I probably would never have been able to tell you what I saw on Instagram if you asked me a day later. But if you ask me a week later, I can definitely tell you about the stuff that I spoke about with my mum, because it was much more quality in-depth time. So I absolutely implore you, when you are spending time with your family, increase the time that you're spending with them, but also increase the quality of that time by really being present within that moment with them. Number 21, financial literacy requires you to seek education. It's not taught in schools and never will be. I really, really don't think it's in school's best interest to start to teach us financial education. And I used to think differently. I used to think that, of course, we should introduce courses on taxes, insurance, and mortgages, and a whole host of other things, investing, for example, and compound interest. But I think what I was like at even like 14, 15, I don't know if I would have been that tuned into it. Maybe I would have. Maybe I'm doing myself a disservice, but I wasn't massively tuned in. Maybe they could deliver it in a way that would be really engaging, and I'll leave that to more creative and better minds than mine. But I don't think it's going to be taught in schools. So you need to seek out your own education, and you need to find voices that speak to you in the right way. I found sources like Andrew Craig was probably one of the leading ones. I've listened to podcasts like the recent guest Pete Matthews. You need to find sources that speak the way that you need to hear, but with the premise of the information being good, of course, and educate you in a way that's going to make you financially literate to understand how to save more, how to spend less, how to invest more, how to invest in a way that you're happy with based on the timelines that you have and the risk appetite that you've got and the risk tolerance that you've got. Financial literacy is very, very difficult to attain unless you go looking for it, and it really takes a little bit of effort. But once you've made that small effort, it literally pays off to try and not be too corny. Number 22, masculinity isn't toxic. Bad actors can use any excuse to justify their behaviors. The world needs masculinity. I truly believe this. I spoke about it recently with Rob Lipsett. Masculinity, it's had like a really aggressively bad PR campaign in recent years, much linked to this kind of virtue signaling woke society that I really don't agree with. And I think you can use any form of ideology or any form of description to paint things badly. So like somebody who's really masculine and does bad things, of course they're like, you would tar masculinity with that brush. But masculinity for me also is men being supportive and providers of those around them, bringing them on, being polite and gentle and supportive and good, not necessarily like the masculinity that the media are trying to maybe paint, where it's somebody that's like a drunken, big, angry lout who takes steroids and wants to be aggressive. I don't think that's masculinity at all. Masculinity is knowing the capabilities that you have as a man and channeling them in the correct ways. It's that whole Jordan Petersonism, like men are monsters, but good men are mastering the fact that they have those monstrous capabilities and keeping them under control and serving themselves and those around them in a really aligned and purposeful, correct way rather than otherwise. And I think to demasculinize society has probably led to some of the problems that we're seeing around identity and the male mental health crisis. Because if you tell men they're inherently bad, then of course they may either fulfill that prophecy and behave in that way, self-fulfilling prophecy, or they reject and move away from some of the things that men actually benefit from doing on a regular basis. Number 23, the main requirements in a career are fulfillment and purpose. This one's fairly self-explanatory, so I won't linger on it for too long. But any career that you look at, you absolutely need fulfillment in terms of the things that you do day to day. So you need to be fulfilled with the different tasks that you do on at least a large percentage of the things that you're doing during your working day. And you need to be working towards something, whether that's we're going to grow the division I work in this year, or we're going to create a new product that's really going to benefit our customers, and that's our purpose and that's our driver. It cannot just be that I clock in to get a wage. There's an element of fulfillment, and like I get a fulfillment from financially doing better. So when I hit my bonus, of course, I feel greater fulfillment because there's some sort of feedback loop that says, Colin, you've done a really good job. Congratulations. Here's an extra however much. That is really, really positive. But you cannot just clock in for money. There needs to be an element of fulfillment beyond in terms of the actions that you do and the feedback loop that you get. So, for example, I still get a buzz from closing a new deal or getting a client to meet me for the first time that's never met my company before and doesn't do anything with us. There's an element of fulfillment because I've actually done the work that's resulted in that. And even if that doesn't lead to a deal that earns me X amount of commission or however many £1,000, I still feel like I've benefited from being part of the purpose, which is to drive more people to use my company in the future. Number 24, don't try and be everything to everybody. Opinions are not all of equal value. I really believe that there's always going to be people that criticize you. There's actually a lot of mental models and razors that I've been getting into recently, mostly through CEO Bloom, but also through Jamie Alderton, who I'm a big fan of as well, and his Body and the Beast podcast. There's always going to be people that say negative things about you, regardless of how good or well-intentioned you are. I did joke that Richard was heavily criticized about like how he spends his money and how he shows his possessions online, and behind the scenes he's doing quite a lot of good things. And people will always have opinions that may not be factually correct based on all the information, because they might not have all the information to hand, but equally they might just decide to interpret them in the different ways. So I think Jamie Alderton actually says, like, you could he could save somebody from a burning building and people would still call him an arsehole. And I genuinely think that's the case with a lot of things. Like, you shouldn't take everything to heart that everyone says, because not everyone is ever going to act in their best interest. And equally, some people's opinions just might be wrong. Like, they just might not have the mental faculties to produce fair opinions based on the evidence that you see. It's a funny game. Like, even in the Goldfish Bowl that there's Glasgow and Scottish football, I could see a Celtic player score a good goal, and my chimp brain is fighting me to say that it's not a good goal because it's a Celtic player. Whereas if I saw a Rangers player score that goal, of course I would praise it. It's just a ridiculous set of circumstances. So don't try and be everything to everybody. Like, for example, I'm never going to cheer for the Celtic manager, so he shouldn't ever try and be everything to me, because it's just not possible. That's a really silly example, but hopefully beneficial. Number 25, the less state and government input to my life, the better. I think if the last couple of years showed us anything, the state is not always the most informed or best actor to make decisions about your life, and them having more input than ever before in terms of what we can and cannot do, for me, it's just a big no. And I am somebody that advocates for a lot of personal responsibility and a lot of personal autonomy in doing things that I can do and I can control, and having the state take more of my money through taxation and distribute it and spend it on lots of different projects I maybe don't agree with. That for me is a big no, and I would much rather the state was very minimal, had a very low level of influence over most areas of my life, whether that's taxation, what else? It should have a basic police force, a basic health service. The basics should be there, but the less that they take involvement with in terms of what I do, the absolute better. Like, as long as I'm not behaving in a way that's reckless or dangerous to society, I would rather people just stayed out of my business. And I think that the more people are allowed to do their own thing and look after themselves and those around them, the better, rather than necessarily relying on the government. Number 26, speak clearly, be articulate, and try to be understood by as many people as possible. This has caused a few people to be critical of me before, because I've said that you shouldn't always try and speak with too much of a regional accent. And I really believe that when you are trying to speak to a wider audience, as this podcast, I think it's been played in 114 countries now, which is absolutely wild. If I spoke with a really strong Glaswegian accent on this mic, then I would massively isolate the number of people that could listen to it and understand and benefit from the podcast and the guests and the conversations that I have. Equally, when I have conversations with friends that are from Glasgow, like even I've been in the car before with my brother, and my friend's been driving us, and he's been like, I cannot understand you two when you get going. And that's my brother and I, who don't have particularly strong regional accents. But of course, it gets stronger when you are with somebody that's from the same place as you and has the same sort of dialect. So for me, I would massively encourage people to try and be as clearly and well spoken as possible and be articulate. It's a real superpower. If you're able to speak clearly and be understood and be heard, many people will benefit from it, and try to be understood from as many people as possible. And that's not to try and be snobbish and tell you not to speak with slang. But I think the stats speak for themselves. It's much better to be understood by more people and able to be a clear communicator than necessarily to impress somebody by using a particular phrase that's common to your area. Number 27, learn and use somebody's name. It shows respect and is the most beautiful sound in the world to them. This is actually one of the lessons I learned from How to Win Friends and Influence People, which is a book by Dale Carnegie. I always make an effort to learn somebody's name and remember it. I even do it in my Instagram DM. So some of the people listening to this will be laughing that I use their name when I voice note them back, or when they maybe sent me a message about the podcast. I truly think it's important to remember somebody's name. If I meet somebody in work capacity, when I shake their hand, I'll say, hi, my name's Colin, what's your name? And or if it's somebody I know or semi-know, I'll get their name and I'll repeat it back to them, and I want to remember it. It's so important that you get somebody's name correct. It's a mark of respect and a mark of valuing them as a human being. And it is true, it's the most beautiful sound in the world to them. When somebody uses my name, it just feels great. Like they've recognized my name, they've said it properly, they've pronounced it in the correct way. And that's something in the modern world where we are very multicultural. Making sure that you pronounce somebody's name correctly is very important too. So if you're not quite sure, ask initially, ask immediately, because it's much more awkward if it goes for a couple of days or a couple of weeks and you're saying, and how is it I say your name again? And I swear to God, I use Google all the time. If I've got a particular client that I'm going to phone, I'm not quite sure how to say their name, I'll go and look. And then when I do say their name, I'll say, hi, is that whatever their name is? And if they say, oh, yes, yes, I'll say, I just wanted to check, I'm saying your name correctly, aren't I? It's maybe my accent, but I'm pronouncing it as whatever. And then they'll come back to you and they'll tell you, and you address the elephant in the room early and you try and use their name correctly. Number 28, time invested and effort expended in disciplined behaviors equals success eventually. Shout out to Dan Meredith in this one, previous podcast guest, and I think he's got another book coming out soon, but this is from his first book, How to Be Fucking Awesome, which is an absolute belter of a self-development book. But the time and effort that you put in and the disciplined behaviors that you show will inevitably end up in success, as long as those efforts are expended in the right place and those disciplined behaviors are working towards things that are in alignment with your goals. You're going to end up successful because you're going to just do the reps over and over again. The form's going to be good. You're going to stick to the things you're going to do. You're going to resist temptation to do things that don't serve you, and it's going to add up to success over the longer term. I truly, truly believe that. It actually quite links heavily to number 29, which is fitness and taking control of how you look is a gateway to improvement in other areas. I spoke about this at length with David Hatt and Chris Burns in episode 141, where we spoke about fitness as a gateway self-development drug to wider improvement within your life. And I really, really believe that if you can control your physical being through your movement, your mindset, your nutrition, the things you put in your mouth, the things that you do, the amount of sleep that you get, there's so much that you can do off the back of that, because it teaches you the positive feedback loop. It teaches you that the effort that you expend and the disciplined behaviors that you put in and the time that you do it across will result in success in that particular field. So apply it in other areas. So I really, really believe that if you can look after yourself to the best possible ability, and that's not to say you need to become some sort of shredded bodybuilder that does photo shoots like I've done. It's nothing to do with that. But I know people that look after the body to an extent where they look and feel happy and they move well and they are healthy, genuinely healthy in mind and body. And it's led to massive improvements in other areas as well. They're maybe not the most jacked guy in the gym. It doesn't matter. But they show up 3 days a week and they track the nutrition largely and they eat whole foods. I mean, that's pretty good, isn't it? Because it covers those bases and it allows you to perform in those other areas. Number 30, and the very last one that we'll cover during this episode, is action precedes competence. Without experience and exposure, you will not become confident. I hosted Dr. Aziz, who's a confidence coach, back on, I want to say episode 49. It's somewhere in the 40s. And he spoke about confidence as a muscle, and you have to train it as a muscle and look to build it up over time. And that comes with the 2 E words that we use there, experience and exposure. So you build muscle by experiencing more reps and more sets and more volume over time, and the exposure that you get towards that stimulus. Getting more action and exposure and experience to the different things that you need to do, that is going to lead to you being more competent and better at it. The first time that you went into barbell back squat, you were probably shaking like a shitting dog. And a few weeks after that, you probably had the 20 plates either side and you were able to do some reps, you were able to move. 6 months after that, you went in and it was second nature to just push your hips back, drop your knees out, whatever the form is that you follow and the cues that you've got in your head, you probably don't even have to think about them as much anymore. Now you're just competent and you do them, and you're confident that you can go in and do that. That is applicable to so many different areas of life. And I know I'm harking on about fitness here as a self-development gateway, but action and practice will precede any ability of competence. Like I play my best golf when I've been practicing and putting in the actions and putting in the reps. And I'm better at golf now than I was when I started at 12 years old, because I've played for years and years and years. I've got so much experience, so much exposure to it, and I'm confident with my clubs because I know how I'm likely to hit them based on all the hundreds of reps that I've done beforehand. I'm confident when I step on a podcast with almost any guest because I have had lots of conversations before. I've spoken to the microphone, I've set up the laptop, I've had the StreamYard stream ready to open. I've got my questions and my topics that I'm kind of keen to ask about. I don't necessarily need to follow them all because I've built up the experiences and the exposure to feel competent and to feel confident to deliver that conversation. And it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen immediately. It was built up over years of presenting and work, and then of course doing over 150 podcasts now. And I implore you to take the time to do the actions to get good at the thing that you're trying to do. And of course, you're going to be more competent, you're going to be better at it, and you're going to be confident with it over time as well. I really hope that you've enjoyed the 30 lessons that we've got into today. It's it's a fun one to record. It's not going to come out right around my birthday. My birthday was back on the 10th of October. But as a belated birthday present, if you are enjoying the show, please make sure you're following or subscribed on the app that you're on. You've left a 5-star rating if you're listening on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, and you share the podcast with a friend. The show has grown at a rate of knots, and I cannot continue to have amazing conversations with people unless you share the podcast with other people like you, and we grow a stronger, bigger, braver audience, and we're all going in the same direction. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.